Hello, this is Conversations with Marsha, sponsored by the Great Connections, which is a program of Reliance College. At Reliance College, we specialize in innovative and transformative education for young adults. We build them a life of adventure and creative achievement. Please visit our website at reliancecollege.org. I'm Marsha Familaro-Enright, the director of the programs. In Conversations with Marsha, we talk about a variety of educational issues. Today, we're very lucky to have with us Peter Wood, who is the president of the National Association of Scholars. This is a wonderful organization of which I've been a member since 2006. They focus on non-political, non-partisan issues of education and what education is best across the spectrum. Peter is here with us today, and I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your background, Peter, and how you ended up at National Association of Scholars.
Well, I'm a professional academic. I was a professor of anthropology at Boston University for many years, and I also went into the administration there as associate provost and later the chief of staff to the president of the university. I left Boston University in 2005 to become provost of a small college in New York City. That lasted for about 2 years, and then I came to the National Association of Scholars, where I've been ever since. So that's really my whole career right there. I still think of myself as an anthropologist, but I'm also a kind of defrocked academic who's kept my attention on what happens at colleges and universities that I no longer teach.
Was it some events that were going on in academia that led you to leave and go to the presidency of NAS?
Well, I mean, there's always a story behind the story. I had been a major research university for most of my career at that point, and then I had this short stint at the King's College in New York City, a small evangelical college. I was recruited there to essentially get their program off the ground. It was an old college that had gone financially bankrupt and then reopened under new ownership. So they brought me in to help recruit a faculty and develop a curriculum. And I had a great time doing that for a little over a year. But then the trustees of the college and the president became much more concerned about recruitment and focusing on matters that seemed to me to threaten the standards that I was trying to put in place. It didn't feel like a good fit for me any longer, and I had this opportunity at NAS. I decided to go.
Oh, thanks for explaining. So tell us a little bit more about NAS so the audience can hear about your programs and the purpose of it.
Well, we're a fairly old organization as these things go. We were formally created in 1987, but we had a kind of shadow existence before that for 5 or 6 years as the Campus Coalition for Democracy was the name of it. When it was formally incorporated in New York, the idea was to gather together as many senior academics as possible to push back against what the founders of the organization saw as the rising tide of political correctness, that the curriculum was moving leftward, that respect for genuine academic freedom was diminishing, that there were many other ominous clouds that suggested that the core values of higher education were at some threat. Initially, it drew together people at the time of rather spectacular reputation, major academics across the country. Most of them actually were fairly liberal in their political outlook, so it wasn't founded as a conservative organization, but pushing back against the academic left turned out to be a hazardous enterprise. Pretty much everybody who got involved was quickly reassigned a new identity as arch conservative.
Ah,
Um, that that didn't hurt right away. There were still plenty of people who were willing to brave that risk. But by the late 1990s, it was clear that rather than being an organization that could champion reforms that were also upheld by the most respected people in higher education, we'd been marginalized. We were becoming a voice of dissent for a new status quo. And when I came in 2007, I would say the National Association of Scholars had really faded from the national scene. It had been a pretty robust organization for its first maybe 15 years, and that was clearly on its way out. So since I've been here as the president officially in 2009, the effort has been to put NAS back into the discussion nationally of the most important issues in higher education. That has meant a lot of changes in the way we go about our work. In its first incarnation from 1987 to the mid 2005 or so, the idea was to try to reform higher education by appealing to faculty members, administrators, and trustees to get serious. You're wasting the cultural capital of a great institution, and we will work quietly inside your institution to see if we can pull it back into safer waters.
mhm,
I made the decision that that approach was no longer viable,
mhm,
that the left had sufficiently captured enough of higher education that appealing to people's better judgment wasn't going to work, and that we would have to move instead to addressing kinds of concerns that people who care about higher education but who are not necessarily drawing their monthly paycheck from it would be willing to take up. So we became an organization that started looking at the places that the powers that be, the regime in charge, didn't necessarily want to talk about. So we started doing things like tracing the disappearance of Western civilization survey courses.
mhm.
Over the years, we acquired a rather large collection of college catalogs going back to the early 1960s. So it was a bit tedious, but it was possible to trace a year by year disappearance of Western civilization survey courses, literally.
Oh, interesting. Mhm.
In 1963, among the top 50 universities in the country, as we judged them then, every single one of them had a 2-semester Western civilization survey course. By 2010, when we concluded our survey, we found one that still had a Western civilization survey course, and it was 1 semester. That was the College of William and Mary.
Oh,
Soon as our report came out and they caught on that they were all alone in this, they abolished it.
oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
So,
I would have guessed it was Columbia.
well, Columbia still has its core program in a sense. They've
Mhm.
altered it in some fashion. It can't really be called a Western civilization survey course because it is a kind of great books light approach.
Mm,
It has certainly merit, and I wouldn't for a moment downgrade its importance, because it does now stand pretty much alone among the Ivy League and elite colleges and universities, and having even that much.
yes. Mhm,
But it has been diminished from what it once was.
mhm,
Anyway, so we started with that. We did a few other tentative stabs at something. I did a 2-year study of Bowdoin College on the coast of Maine. We titled it, "What Does Bowdoin Teach?"
mhm.
And it was, again, a deep historical dive. We got access to their archives. We went back to the very early 19th century and traced what this particular college had deemed worthy of teaching to its students all the way to our terminal date, which was 2013, I think it was. And it was a real eye-opening experience, not just for our readers, but for me, just how much this college, which ranks very high in the list of America's elite liberal arts colleges, had discarded most of what we would consider, or at least I would consider, the liberal arts. Now, you're asking about what NAS is. We have a mission statement, unless I quote myself erroneously, I'll read it. And education of scholars upholds the standards of a liberal arts education that fosters intellectual freedom, searches for the truth, and promotes virtuous citizenship. Well, the intellectual freedom part probably doesn't rankle people very much, except perhaps in the last 3 or 4 years when we've learned that intellectual freedom is a code for white supremacy or something like that, and that true intellectual freedom doesn't exist. What we want is equity instead. Well, anyway.
That's what they're accusing you of, right. The radical left.
Right, the radical left has its ways of saying it wants intellectual freedom, but not really.
Yeah.
We'll go off.
It's newspeak. Yeah. I mean, the way they're talking now, it's newspeak. So.
The second part of that was the search for truth, which again, I would have thought entirely uncontroversial through most of the history of American higher education. But once again, the left has redefined that. We now know that truth is just a mask of power, and that the search for truth is a way in which the privileged maintain their privilege against everybody else. So even that innocuous claim has been rendered controversial, but we're sticking by it anyway. The third part, promoting virtuous citizenship, probably has been on the outs since the 1980s anyway.
Yes, heaven help you that you're doing that.
So we have, can't say we've stuck our necks out. We've been promoting these goals from our very beginning, and they strike me as completely wholesome and very attractive to a great many Americans who wrongly suppose that when they send their children off to college, they're going to get something like that. Well, you know, maybe something like that with a varnish of political activism added to it, but nonetheless, deep down, it's still going to be about intellectual freedom, the search for truth, and some sort of commitment to the popular good, even if it's not virtuous citizenship. Those things just aren't true anymore. And we spend our time patiently trying to point out how they're not true, that there are ideologies that have rooted themselves on campus that prevent these things from really happening. I was just, before we began our conversation, looking at a statement from a respected scholar, but no longer an academic, inveighing against one of the Supreme Court justices who has declared that the global warming ideology is just plain fact, and that there is no respectable person in the world who denies the existence of man-made catastrophic global warming. Well, you know, that just happens not to be true. I deal with plenty of people in the hard sciences who have significant reservations about the way in which global warming is measured. Well, this is not a central issue for me. We did publish a report about 8 years ago on the sustainability movement on campus. But what is a central issue for me is the politicization of the natural sciences. We are watching one gigantic piece of American higher education that has begun to compromise itself in favor of producing results that are politically popular or demanded by people in a position to hand out favors like government grants. That kind of willingness to tell the dissenters to shut up or else, to prevent the expression of views that fail to conform to a popular ideology, it's the sort of thing that we oppose.
Mhm.
Now, it's difficult to do this now without being accused of being political actors in this. And I have to admit that it's very seldom now that I find people who speak as partisans of the Democratic Party or as people who are self-declared liberals who are willing to join in this effort to try to resuscitate higher education. That doesn't mean that we speak for the Republican Party or try to brand ourselves as a conservative voice, but I'm well aware of the realities of this, that you cannot now dissent from the dominant views on campus without being pigeonholed in those categories. So there's a fine line here between where I expect we will find supporters and friends and where I'm willing to position NAS explicitly.
Well, the left has turned everything into the political. So, and you know, with their view that truth is social instead of reality oriented, then they'll say anything that you claim as truth is your truth. It depends on your power. I mean, everything falls apart. I was curious if you would, so they turned virtue into promoting their power. That's what becomes virtue for them. But I was curious to what you would consider virtuous citizenship.
Well, I will break it down to a few pieces. To start with, the simplest one is that to be a virtuous citizen is to know something of the history of your country, something that's actually accurate, founded in the record of known facts. In 2019, the New York Times published the 1619 Project. The primary author and editor was Nicole Hannah-Jones. I started a project the very next day after the New York Times published that, August 18th, 2019. We called it the 1620 Project because it was obvious from the day on which this thing was published that it was based on a kind of historical fantasy. It was indeed true that enslaved Africans were brought to the coast of Virginia in the mid-August of 1619. It was not true, as the New York Times was proclaiming, that these were the first slaves in America, not the first African slaves in America. It was not true that that was the beginning of chattel slavery in America. I didn't know at the time all the details of what happened in 1619, but I made it my immediate business to go start reading the actual history of the period, which wasn't hard to find. And what I found, for example, was that the slaves brought to Virginia had been captured by English pirates in the Caribbean from a Spanish vessel that was taking them to Mexico. Most of those slaves were sold again into slavery in the Bermudas, but then there was a handful left over and the pirates brought them to Virginia, where they were told by the Virginians, we don't have any slavery here, no thank you.
Really?
But what instead happened was that the pirates relinquished their slaves for food. Their provisions had run short, and the Virginians took these sorry individuals and turned them into indentured servants. The Virginia colony didn't have slavery, but it did have indentured servants, most of whom, or almost all of whom at that point, were English. But the difference between a slave and an indentured servant is that the indentured servant serves a term and then is set free, which is exactly what happened to those individuals. Within a few years, they were all set free. Some of them intermarried with the white population. A few of them became quite prosperous and owned their own plantations. This is by no means to excuse the institution of slavery. It's just to say, well, what are the facts?
Yeah.
Did we really begin that time, that place? The answer is no. Slavery did get underway in Virginia about a half century later, but 1619 to start with is just an erroneous date.
You think they picked that to try to make it before Plymouth Plantation?
I think they picked it to be before Plymouth Plantation. They also picked it in order to be able to claim a straight 400-year history.
Oh, because it was published in 2019.
It would have done well to say that it was a 25-year history instead, or something like that.
I was just thinking, because Tocqueville attributes so much of the nature of the U.S. to that original colony. And I didn't know if the writers of this project were even informed enough to realize that, but if they were, they might want to claim, oh no, slavery happened first.
Well, there's nothing about that in the original 1619 project.
Oh, okay.
It has since been turned into a 600-page book, and you can find a few references there. But my response was to write my own book titled 1620, A Critical Response to the 1619 Project, which interweaves what was going on at Plymouth Colony with what was going on in Virginia and other matters. The history, we're sort of still dealing with the question of what does it mean to be a virtuous citizen? Virtuous citizen. A virtuous citizen is certainly somebody who has a grasp of where our republic came from. That grasp cannot be had without some knowledge of the very early colonial founding. Virginia itself in 1619 created the House of Burgesses, which is sometimes presented as the first representative legislature in the country. So important things were happening in Virginia. That Virginia legislature was a little bit of a sham, and that the Virginia company basically appointed the people who would serve in it. So it wasn't really a representative body except notional sense. But what was happening in Plymouth, I could maybe go on too long about this. I'll try to restrain myself.
It's fascinating though.
What happened in Plymouth is that before the Mayflower reached what was going to be the Plymouth colony, it touched on the outer edge of Cape Cod, and the people on board, only about half of them being the people that we call pilgrims, became very irate because they had intended to reach what they thought of as northern Virginia, way off course, and the non-religious component of the company said, the contracts that we signed back in London that said we were going to Virginia are now null and void. When this ship comes to land, we're going to get off and go our own way, and we're free to do that. The leader of the religious faction said, that's really a bad idea. We are nearly out of food. It's the beginning of winter in November of 1620. We don't know what kind of reception we're going to get from the native population. To survive this, we're going to need to stick together. So they sat down and negotiated, and what they came up with was a very brief agreement. It's just 200 words long, and it's what we call the Mayflower Compact. Now, probably every school child, at least of generations past, had at least heard of the Mayflower Compact, but it is worth knowing a little bit more about it than just that name. What the compact did was say that we're going to be a self-governing group of people. We will elect our leaders. We will establish laws by the consent of the governed. We will have complete religious freedom. Those of you who are not part of our religious company are free to worship any way you want to, and we are not going to impose on you. But we will meet for mutual defense. We will try to parley with the native peoples, and we will see if we can survive this ordeal. Well, they all signed it, and that document, which one might have thought would fall apart at the first sign of contention, didn't fall apart. It really became the charter of the first truly self-governed entity created by Europeans in the Americas. They did reach a treaty with the native tribes, a treaty that lasted unbroken for 50 years. The need to meet for mutual defense was upheld. There was a a wonderful story told here of people who survived against terrible odds. About half of them died during that first winter, that they soldiered on and they prevailed. Now, the story of Plymouth Colony, if it had been a one-off thing and it died just there, would be a really interesting historical footnote. What makes it even more interesting, though, and more than a footnote, is that it created a template, a model for how Americans could govern themselves. The New England town was modeled on Plymouth. Now, not long after Plymouth was established, and never recognized by that, for that matter, by the British Crown, the British Crown did recognize the people that we call the Puritans, who established the colony at Charlestown, later Boston, and eventually took over the Plymouth colony. But what they took over had already achieved its purpose. It had set a model that even the Puritans recognized as powerful. As they fanned out from Charlestown and Boston to eastern littoral of Massachusetts, they adopted the Plymouth approach of small self-governing towns. It left New England. It became the model for how much of America was settled. Clear into the late 19th century, when the West was being settled, what was the model for that? It was basically the Plymouth model. Here's how we get together and govern ourselves when there's no outside authority, at least no handy outside authority, to come in and present the rule of law and to maintain order. That's how they did it. So Plymouth is not just a footnote, it is the starting point for a nation that would eventually come into existence modeling the same principles. We are speaking on July 5th. We just had our Independence Day celebration yesterday, going back to the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. That document owes something to the Pilgrims. It also owes a great deal to the Enlightenment and to the centuries of development between the founding of Plymouth Colony and the creation of the American Republic. But what they have in common is this notion that we, the people, can govern ourselves. We don't need kings. We don't need some outside authority to impose its ideas on us. We can figure things out for ourselves well enough. That's going to require a fair amount of tolerance, a word that is slipping out of usage now, because when you say tolerance, the left likes to think of, oh, you're only tolerating us, but we want you to celebrate us. Well, actually, tolerance is maybe the most we can hope for from people with whom we profoundly disagree, and maybe the most we can hope for from ourselves towards people whose views we regard as really bad. So I think we get that in the American Revolution, and we can thank God that for more than 200 years we've been able to maintain it. Whether we can maintain it into the future has become an open question in this country. I recognize that. The book that I wrote immediately after 1620 was titled Wrath, America Enraged. I do view us as now a country that is just overwhelmed with anger towards each other. And I don't have any namby-pamby solutions to that. The anger is real, the rage is out there. The question is whether we can hold it back sufficiently to find our better lives.
And thank you for that historical explanation. It's very interesting. Going back to the question of what's a virtuous citizen, so what other characteristics would you include?
Well, a virtuous citizen knows that he or she is part of a self-governing republic. That self-governing republic has institutions that have grown increasingly complex over the centuries. So in order to engage in self-government, you have to know not only the history, you have to know something about the shape of our government and how we go about finding our leaders and electing them. You need to know, for example, something about what a grand jury is and how our jury system operates. When one is called for military service, how long is that and why? Where do we find the principles by which, when we gather as juries, we render verdicts that someone is guilty or not guilty? those are not self-evident things. You have to learn them. You have to learn that our government is divided into three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches, and that the legislative branch is a bicameral legislature. Those things used to be taught in grade school. They maybe still are in some sense, but they've really become vanishing knowledge when one looks at the debates that broke out after the recent Supreme Court decision. You find people in all seriousness and with access to the mainstream press saying, well, why don't we just abolish the judiciary?
Yeah.
Well, there's a reason why we don't.
Yeah.
There is the now commonly heard argument that we don't need the electoral college in our presidential races. All that's doing is allowing these nowhere states out west to have disproportionate say in who governs the country. And that's a terrible idea. We should let our leaders all be elected by California and New York, and that's it. You know, that's a view founded in really profound ignorance. To be a virtuous citizen, you have to know what our institutions are and why they are. Perhaps after you've learned that, you still think it would be a good idea to abolish the electoral college, but at least at that point you would be arguing with some knowledge of why it was there in the first place and what function that it serves. Now, we could talk for a great long time about the complexity of American institutions. People really should know that. Now, of course, being an academic myself, I might want people to know a lot more than they really have to know.
Yeah.
And I'll plead guilty to that. But even if you strip back my preference for more knowledge rather than fewer, there are a lot of basic things that if you don't know, you can't really operate as an effective citizen of the country.
So the core of being a virtuous citizen is knowing about the government that and the way that the history of the country and the government that we're under and how the institutions operate. That's what you view it as.
I would add one more to that.
Okay.
And this last one will be the most controversial. I think you can't really be a virtuous citizen without some love of your country. Doesn't mean, you know, a kind of all abasing my country right or wrong. It does mean that you owe something to the people who brought this country into existence, the soldiers from the American Revolution on through today who kept us free. You owe something to the citizens who make our jury system work, something to the citizens who try to maintain the integrity of our elections. There's a commonality that goes beyond just a shared language and a shared popular culture. It means that you really do have to love your fellow citizens at some level. And I think without that, the other pieces lose their grip. We want people to feel in their imaginations and their hearts that they belong to a nation that, though it has done wrong things and maybe terrible things over the course of its history, has really strived for human betterment and perfection and freedom. Those things are worth upholding and loving.
Well, I mean, one of the things that people like to confuse when they talk about American patriotism is that American patriotism can be very different than patriotism in other countries, in that it can be a patriotism about the ideas and the organization and the history that made us what you just described, instead of just patriotism for the land and the place that you live, regardless of what happened or the ideas that it was based on.
And it's not blood and soil patriotism as it is in most of Europe, but it's a patriotism that recognizes those central ideals of liberty and equality that were set forth in the Declaration, imperfectly realized at any given point in our history, but nonetheless, they're the guide stars that have led us forward. And the belief in those things, which has drawn to this country immigrants over its whole history, is the patriotism of which I'm speaking.
Yeah, and one of the distinctions that I think is very important is that other kinds of patriotism are tribal collectivism. Their love of just the tribe that you're in and everything about it, its culture or whatever. And whereas our country is based on a rational individualism.
Yeah.
And you have to understand that that's very different. So I was wondering, so NAS has books that it produces and it does research projects. And I also know that you were instrumental in exposing the Confucius Institute racket. Could you talk about that a little bit? What are the Confucius Institutes? What happened? How did you find out about it?
Well, I'll tell it as a story. About 8 years or so ago, one of our members in Ohio, we have about 4,000 members of the NAS, called me up and said that his university president had just announced that they were bringing a Confucius Institute to campus. And did I know what a Confucius Institute was?
Mm-hmm.
Simple answer was I'd never heard of them before. I had no idea what they were. But being a research-oriented body, I said, I'll do my best to find out. I put one of my researchers, my best researcher actually, on this. Her name was Rochelle Peterson. And we went out and convinced the foundation to give us some seed money to undertake an investigation. I thought at the time that this was going to be a pretty simple thing to do. It sounded like Confucius Institutes were an effort by the Chinese government to gain some goodwill in America by bringing in teachers to teach Chinese language, Mandarin language courses, a little bit of Chinese culture, and that they were steering clear of politics and economics and the like. Well, it only took a month or so before we realized that we were stubbing our toes on the root of a much bigger tree than that.
Mm-hmm.
We'd go on to college campuses to try to talk to the people running the Confucius Institutes. They flatly refused to answer any questions at all. The staff that they had, likewise, for the most part, avoided us, although in a few cases, people whispered that we should meet them off campus somewhere for a conversation. And we were soon getting the picture that Confucius Institutes had a veneer, a surface that you could look at that looked pretty wholesome. They were teaching Mandarin courses for sure, but they were doing a lot more than that. One thing that was quickly apparent was that they were surveillance organizations that were watching the overseas Chinese students. Overseas Chinese students were at least the biggest component of international students in American higher education, about 500,000 of them here at any one time.
Boy, I didn't know it was that many. Wow.
They could get in and work in their degree programs here, of course, only with the permission of the Chinese government. And that meant that where they went to college was under the control of the Chinese government. So the Chinese government could kind of turn on the spigot and give your university a lot more students, all of whom were paying full tuition, and ratchet it back and say, not so many. So there was an instrument of control already built into this. But those students, once here, frequently found themselves attracted to some of the liberties of American life. They could begin to be individuals for the first time. The Chinese government, the agency that runs these in China, is called the Hanban. It was their basically propaganda agency. Decided that that had to be prevented. So the Confucius Institutes were staffed by Chinese nationals, basically employees of the Hanban, many of them Communist Party members, whose real job was to keep an eye on what was going on with these Chinese students. Well, that sounded pretty bad, and we found quite a few Chinese students who were willing to tell us about this, but strictly off the record in private. They were terrified of what would happen if they were caught. We started looking for other things like the charters of these Confucius Institutes. What were they really about? Well, the charters were written in Chinese. and the universities refused to divulge them. So it took some doing, but we did get our hands on several of them. We found that Confucius Institutes were to be governed, even though they were on American college campuses, under Chinese law and Chinese courts.
What?
The more and more details began to leak out. It turns out Confucius Institutes were especially prone to crop up at major American research universities, where the employees of the institutes could spend a portion of their time becoming friendly with American researchers in high-tech areas. Since then, we've learned that China developed several parallel programs. One of them is called the 1,000 Talents Program, which was meant to recruit American academics, pair them with their supposed Chinese counterparts in China, develop a relationship there. Basically, this became the conveyor belt, maybe something faster than a conveyor belt, to get taxpayer-funded US research out of the American universities into the hands of the Chinese. Right? You think of how was it that China suddenly developed a space program rivaling that of the US in no time flat? Well, basically, they stole it. As they did.
Same way the Soviets did.
Same way the Soviets did. There are deeper, more nefarious aspects of this. Where did the virus that came to
The Wuhan virus? Yeah.
It came from Wuhan. Wuhan University, by the way, was partially funded via Dr. Fauci's machinations. American research went to Wuhan University. Wuhan University worked with the government lab there. It's all quite murky at this point. We don't know exactly how that virus leaked out of the lab into the general population. We do know that American researchers had a hand in it. Does this all go back to Confucius Institutes? Well, maybe. There's, again, a lot of dust in the eyes approach here, that China was not putting all its bets on one program. It had maybe a dozen separate programs going at the same time. We got hold of the tail of the tiger here, and we started pulling on it. Well, we published our report on the Confucius Institutes in 2017, and initially it got a fair amount of interest in the Chinese American community, and then nothing. And then one day, the State Department called on us, and then the FBI.
Oh my gosh.
Members of Congress. And
well, good.
Within it took maybe 8 months or so, we suddenly found we had the hottest report in all of American higher education.
Oh my God.
Everybody wanted to know about it and what else we had found. And that's pretty much continued to this day. China responded initially by holding a press conference in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club, in which it lined up presidents and provosts of a bunch of the colleges that they had seduced, all of which came forward in that dutiful Chinese fashion, bowing and saying, the Confucius Institutes are wonderful. They don't do anything wrong. They're the best thing that ever happened to us. Americans began to scoff at that kind of show, and soon the Hanban realized that it needed a different approach. So what's happened in the last 2 years is that Confucius Institutes miraculously started to close. Well, they've not just started to close. When we began our study, there were 118 of them. Now there's fewer than 20. The word went out in the national press, basically, that we'd won. We had convinced China to back off. We didn't believe that for a moment. Rochelle Peterson went back in, and we just released a few weeks ago our newest report titled When Confucius Institutes Closed. What we did there was show that there were universities that announced one day that their Confucius Institutes were closing. The very next day, they would reopen them under a new name. Sometimes they moved them across campus to different offices. Sometimes they moved them to a branch campus. They farmed them out in some fashion. But the close relationship between the Hanban and the universities didn't change at all. The Hanban renamed itself as something like the Institute for Language Instruction. A whole lot of camouflage was put in place, but the routine continues. In the latter days of the Trump administration, Trump got serious about doing something, and a effort was made to really go after the Chinese infiltration of American universities. That got shut down on the very first day of Biden's administration. So we are back into dealing with politics here. Just about everybody knows that Joseph Biden is deeply compromised by China. He has now done everything within his reach to prevent the investigation of American researchers who have been compromised. Well, before Biden took office, the chairman of the chemistry department at Harvard was arrested for his, well, they arrested him on tax charges, but it's really a charge of espionage. But there were several hundred American researchers at that point who had been identified as in the pocket of the Chinese. Most of those investigations have been shut down and people returned to their operations such as they are. So this continues. The US right now is still a sieve in which our best technology is flowing to China, and the American authorities, whose job it is to prevent that sort of thing and to corral the people who are behind it, are sitting on their hands, doing nothing. There are members of the House and the Senate who completely realize what's going on and are eager to do something to stop it, but it's very difficult to stop treason if it is being winked at by the President of the United States.
Yeah, it's really frightful to hear all this. Really, really frightful. Do you think, I mean, there's a lot of pecuniary reasons why these universities welcome these institutes. Do you think there's any element of ideological sympathy?
Yes, in some cases, but let me pause first on the pecuniary part because I mentioned the flow of international students, but that's only half of it. These institutions are also ones in which the college presidents, provosts, sometimes down to the level of deans, are invited over to China and feted and recruited in that sense. In many cases, they are also invited to establish branch campuses or programs in China, which become lucrative in their own right. So there are certainly faculty members who find extra money in their bank accounts, as well as administrators who likewise benefit in that fashion.
Oh my gosh.
Also benefit clearly institutionally from the tuition that comes in this way. So there's a lot of money that's changing hands in this path. But as for
institutionally and personally.
Institutionally and personally, yes.
Wow.
On the matter of ideological belief, well, I guess I'm just going to have to don my cynic's hat here. I think a lot of college presidents believe what's ever convenient for them to believe. They've been doing that for a long time. After the George Floyd riots, suddenly we had hundreds and hundreds of American college university presidents who believed that their institutions were deeply racist, had been forever.
Yeah.
That was a belief that they put on with the ease of slipping on a pair of gloves. So when it comes to China, lots of these people are willing to say, well, China is not our enemy. China is just another nation. And, you know, if there are frictions between us, those are best settled by an open door policy and a real willingness to listen to one another. what could be better than to have the voice of people who know China from the inside to come to American campus and teach our students.
Mhm.
And you can put that forward as though you're doing nothing but upholding intellectual freedom and the principles of genuine globalism and diversity of thought in having Confucius Institutes present. I don't know that diversity of thought can ever extend to handing the keys to your home safe or your safe deposit box to someone who is intent on emptying them and shipping the contents abroad. We're dealing here with a country that is, if not a declared enemy of the United States, certainly one that is acting as a deep adversary and competitor. To find that American higher education, by and large, not every institution, not every college president, have been seduced into, that's the word I keep coming back to, the feeling of benignity towards China. That there's nothing wrong here that a little open discussion can't settle. And maybe the real problem is the jingoism or the hostility of the American right wing to the open discussions that we should be having. And that's pretty much where it comes out.
What's interesting about that is, on the one hand, I can see how the ideology of cultural relativism excuses it,
Yes.
Or it can be used as a justification for it, and covers up the pecuniary advantages that you get from it. And on the other hand, of course, there's the irony that we have to be open to people like this, but don't you dare disagree with certain ideologies like equity, diversity, and all that. You know, you can't even discuss that. So there's no, but you know, we could go into a long discussion about the ideological roots of this kind of paradox that goes on, but we won't do that here. So I don't want to keep you too long. Did you had something more you wanted to say?
I was just going to add to that the diversity, equity, inclusion agenda is not making any headway at the University of Shanghai or
no, right.
It's also not making any headway at those institutional plants that American universities have created in China.
Yeah.
Even more basic principles such as freedom of religion do not pertain in China.
No.
The religious movement in China called Falun Gong, which is notoriously repressed by the Chinese and its members arrested and tortured and having their organs harvested, etc. They are a subcaste in China that is miserably mistreated.
Yeah.
Do you think they're any better treated at American universities that open their campuses in Chinese cities? No, they're not.
Yeah, no.
Basic American principles are not being offshored with these institutions that we're trying to build abroad.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be one thing if we could open a campus in Beijing that upheld basic American principles, but that's not what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was glad to see that the Falun Gong's organization, the Epoch Times, is getting more interest and is expanding itself around the country, because they do a reporting that you don't see other places. So that's very interesting. Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer. We've been talking for almost an hour here. Very fascinating information. I just want to make sure that you let the audience know anything you'd particularly like them to know about NAS. The website, we'll put it in the notes. The website is nas.org, where you can find a lot of resources. But is there anything else you'd like to share?
Well, I guess I would put two things on the table that I would want the listeners to know about. One is that we've been deeply involved in the civics crisis of the last few years. We've now seen this working itself out in K-12 education, but we've also created a National Civics Alliance with the membership. We're doing lots of work on that. I mentioned in passing that we're doing lots of work in the natural sciences now as American science goes woke. So those are two big issues for us. But a third thing, which I can't really say is an NAS initiative, but we're involved with it, is that I've been getting together with other academics who are concerned that higher education be an issue in the midterm elections and in the next presidential elections. And we've been putting together a kind of manifesto called The Path to Prosperity. There is a copy of that on our website, but the general idea here is that the prosperity of the nation, as well as the prosperity of college graduates, both depend deeply on our getting higher education right. We are not getting it right now. And in that sense, we are endangering the future of the country, and we are wasting the time and money of the 16 million or so current college students who are likely to be getting educations that are a lot less good than they should be. So if you do go to our website, nas.org, those are some things to look for.
Okay, and we're going to put some information about these things in the notes to the program so people can see them directly. We welcome any questions, and we'll put do you want to be communicated with, or how do you want people to contact NAS?
People can communicate with me directly. My email address is pwood@nas.org. I do get a lot more email than I can possibly answer, but I do my best to keep up with it. And if you're willing to get a short answer from me, you're likely to hear back.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and the very interesting information about NAS and all the work that you're doing. And good luck. I hope it continues. I've been a supporter for all these years, so I'll continue to do so. And we urge other people to be supporters too. NAS is a nonprofit organization, and you can donate at their website. All right. Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.